Okay, so I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. And I'd just like to say Melbourne Water acknowledges the Victorian traditional owners and their elders past and present as the original custodians of Victoria's land and waters. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to the ongoing living culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'd like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we have with us today to the presentation. Great to have you part of this. So thank you for joining us today to hear from Arthur Riley's Institute Senior Scientist Ivor Stewart. And we're going to learn how carp impact our waterways and how an integrated approach can reduce this invasive species to enable ecosystem recovery. So Ivor is a senior research scientist and he has over 30 years experience as a fisheries researcher in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. He specialises in fishways, carp management and restoring native fish populations through excellent river management. Ivor recently led a project to estimate the national biomass of carp in Australia, and I'll hand over to Ivor now.
Thanks, Teresa. Am I coming through loud and clear for you?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Thank you for dialing in. You're either haven't got too much on or you're not outside in the sunshine, or perhaps you've heard that Brad Pitt is actually doing this carp presentation today. So in any case, I will be talking about carp, the 50-year history of environmental impact. We'll be crossing over lots of different areas today, so I hope you find that interesting. So as Teresa said, I work for the Arthur Riley Institute. The Arthur Riley Institute is hidden away in Heidelberg, Melbourne, just near Burgundy Street, and it's part of the Biodiversity Division of DELP. It's the 50-year anniversary of the Arthur Riley Institute this year, and the aim of the Institute through that time is to generate and share knowledge through world-class applied research to support ecosystem management. As Teresa said, my main interest in my 30-odd year career in Queensland, New South Wales, Eastern Australia essentially, has been native fish recovery. Fish like these ones. Another interest of mine is fishways, fish ladders that enable fish migrations for fish to move up and down rivers. And of course, carp. Carp's been a great interest of mine since growing up in the country. I'm a very practical science. I'm really only interested in applied science as it relates to rivers, as it makes rivers better. It improves ecosystem conditions for native fish recovery. So today the talk is broadly structured in terms of why control carp. 50 years of carp impacts. I'll run through a few of those with you, and some case studies that are really interesting. A lot of those from community groups themselves. So carp are a very visible threat. I hope the satellites are working at the minute and this video might play for you. So that's actually an electrofishing boat at work on the Lower Murray in South Australia, and it temporarily stuns fish for collection. Those two guys probably not collecting too many fish, so they'll get a talking to. But that's something we see most springs, is aggregations of carp migrating up rivers. They're adult carp on their way to spawn, usually in wetlands, sometimes in rivers. So in Australia, we're very experienced with dealing with major invaders like rabbits, cane toads, and perhaps the evilest of them all, carp. Carp have a global distribution these days and are invasive in not just Australia, but parts of North America, parts of New Zealand and other locations as well. There are about 4 different strains of carp present in Australia, and they've been here a long time, over 100 years. But it wasn't until the Balaras strain was released near Mildura in the early 1960s that the carp invaded the waterways in big numbers and over broad spatial areas. So by about 1977, on the back of the early 70s floods, carp spread right throughout the Murray-Darling Basin and then into new areas of Tasmania and southeast Queensland by about 1998. And they're still slowly expanding their distributional range. Oddly enough, they're going up in terms of elevation. So in the olden days, they were only up to about 500 metres elevation, then it went to 800 metres, and now it's sitting at about 1,000 metres in the New South Wales Alps. And as it has been quoted many, many times, carp dominate the fish biomass in rivers. And when I say biomass, I will return to that term a little bit during this talk, and that just means kilos of fish, in this case kilos of carp per area, so kilos of carp per hectare. So where are carp in Australia? This is some of the latest mapping, and you can see, if I might use my mouse, you can see they're right through the Murray-Darling Basin in eastern Australia, the rivers and catchments of southern Victoria, over in Adelaide and to the west of Adelaide, in the urban streams around Perth in southwestern Australia, and there's a small population still present in Lake Sorell in Tasmania that's just about eradicated. What this map sort of says to me that's the most interesting is there's still certain parts of eastern Victoria and northeastern New South Wales that remain uninvaded. The reasons for that lack of invasion are not clear. And then the rivers, the tropical rivers of Queensland, up through the Burnett, the Fitzroy and further north, remain uninvaded, as does the Lake Eyre Basin. So an interesting question to me is, why are carp so successful? And because they can exploit a broad range of conditions, and particularly degraded rivers and wetlands. These sorts of habitats really support carp. I'll briefly run through their life history. Carp are typified by that generalist life history. They have fast growth rates. They tend to reach maturity for males at about 1 year and females at 2 years, which is very rapid compared to many native fish. They can reach sizes of up to about 15 kilograms, but that's large. They are long-lived, about 32 years of age in Australia at the maximum, which is broadly consistent with similar sized native fish. They're highly fecund, which means around about 25% of their body mass can be eggs, or putting it a different way, about 1 million eggs in a 5 kilo large female fish. And they have a batch spawning capability where they can spawn part of their gonad at one time, and then a week or two later they can spawn another part, which I guess enables them to take advantage of different ecological conditions and maximise survival rates for young fish. And some of those female fish can even spawn twice within an extended breeding season per year, which is quite unusual. They tend to spawn first compared to many native fish. They tend to spawn by about mid-August when the water temperature's up around about 15.5 degrees. They have a generalist diet. They feed on the bottom for many of the older fish, but they do actually eat native fish as well. They are predatory, especially on small fish. Carp have few natural predators. Very large predatory Murray cod may eat adult fish or goannas or those sorts of things, but once they reach about 400 mils, there are very few natural predators. They're highly mobile, easily travelling 1,000 kilometres in the connected Murray, but movements of say 5-10 kilometres are much more common. They tend to be really excellent at exploiting niches, which means they can move into a new habitat and exploit any sort of vacant niche that's available. And they're highly tolerant of a broad range of conditions, so they can tolerate up to approximately half seawater strength salinities and water temperatures between about 2 and 40 degrees. Very, very tough fish. So for me, when I talk about carp control with colleagues and with community groups, it really comes down to people's personal frames of reference, I think. So it's about how we want our rivers and wetlands to look. And this is a wetland in the Yarra Valley, which is infested with carp, fish like these. So for me, when I turn up to these places, I run through I guess a bit of a script in my head, and that's really, there's no point to controlling carp without recovery of native fauna and flora, and that cuts across all invasive species, so foxes, cats, rabbits, cane toads. I mean, you have to have an ecosystem response to your control effort, or it's not worth doing. So for me, clearly setting a vision before you start out in managing any invasive species is super important. So that may be, in this case, one I'm just throwing up there, is a self-sustaining and diverse river wetland ecosystem with healthy native fish and aquatic vegetation. So for me, it's about where we want to be in 5 years' time in terms of a healthy aquatic ecosystem. And if you can have that vision in your head or have it written down in your plan, then you know what you're working towards and you know why you're trying to control carp and why you're taking other actions to reach this vision. And just emphasising that carp control is one component of achieving your vision. So what are carp impacts? Why are they so bad? Well, they do increase sediments. Their feeding behaviour is to suck up mouthfuls of benthic or bottom silts and muds and to excrete that through their gills as they feed. So they do increase turbidity. They do resuspend nutrients. They do compete with food with other native aquatic animals. They disturb and destroy aquatic vegetation. They distribute parasites. On the top right there, you can see an anchor worm on the fin of a carp. These are a common parasite that carp spread around the river. And on that bottom photo there, you can see the typical damage that carp do under riverbanks. You can see that sort of pugging where carp have pushed their head into the sediment and the bottom material of the river and sucked out mouthfuls of mud. Very typical damage. They do prey upon native fish, and there's new research coming out of Spain saying that there's ecosystem damage that carp do has actually caused declines, measurable declines in wetland birds, including grebes, flamingos and coots. So in terms of dominating the biomass in wetlands and rivers, we talked about a 90% style biomass before, but what that actually means is that once carp reach a level of about 80 kilos, a density of about 80 kilos per hectare, then they start to have these sorts of impacts that you can see in the pictures. And I'll come back to that 80 kilos per hectare. It's highlighted in green to remind me to come back to it. And there are also social impacts as well. So here I took this photo out with Kelvin Berry one day on the lower ovens near Bundalong somewhere there. And you can see the damage that carp have caused when the Ovens River was higher and they got out into that wetland and fed out there. And that's the sort of pugging, the little depressions in the sand bottom of the ovens that carp have caused. And you can see them there a little bit more of a close-up. And then here's a photo from Gunbower Island where you can see a wetland where there's an exclusion fence which keeps carp out of the area inside. You can see the recovery of aquatic plants, and on the other side there's no recovery. And that's not just caused by carp, let's make that clear. That's caused by other factors such as bird feeding as well. but carp are certainly responsible for a large amount of damage to soft-stemmed aquatic vegetation in particular. So with such a tough, versatile fish which reaches enormous densities very quickly, how do we manage these sorts of animals? And this comes down to what we call pest management principles. And I've mentioned one before in terms of defining the vision, what do we want? And these pest management principles apply to rabbits and any other invasive animal too. But it's about setting a really clear objective at the start. It's amazing how often scientists and all sorts of people work really hard in the field to collect data, but they're not clear about their objectives. So setting a very clear objective of, are you trying to eradicate carp or control carp, is really a central important theme throughout this talk. Collecting some preliminary data is always worthwhile to determine what sort of numbers you're dealing with, and then developing a plan. And that plan for carp, if you're not eradicating them, should always be to control their impacts, to reduce the population so that the impacts on aquatic vegetation and water quality and native fish are reduced to manageable levels. And that manageable level is less than 80 kilos of carp per hectare. We always implement multiple actions to reduce pest numbers, and it's a good idea if those actions attack different life stages of carp, not just adults, not just large fish, but young fish as well. We collect our data, adapt our plan, and then monitor recovery. And I'll show some applied examples of this style of pest management principle shortly. I want to return to this 80 kilos per hectare because it's just so important, and I'm not sure whether I've got it across particularly well. So this is I guess, a little bit of a visual way of getting that across. So that's the MCG, 80 kilos per hectare. I don't even know what a hectare is. I'm part of the metric system. So a hectare is actually, to me, it's 100 metres by 100 metres. So that's a footy oval. It's 2 straight kicks either way. Not for me, it's about 40 straight kicks for me, but for someone decent at footy, it's 2 straight kicks. So that's 80 carp, 1 kilo each on the MCG. Any more than that in a river or a wetland, you start to have impacts. But what we often find in Australia, that carp are sitting at about 300 kilos per hectare, much more often. 250, 300 kilos is what I see all the time. And up to about 1,800 kilos or 1.8 tonnes is much more at the far end of the abundances we see, but it does happen. And just as a little frame of reference, the same sorts of principles apply to rabbits, where if you wanted regeneration of native plants, then you'd be looking at about 2 rabbits per hectare, per MCG. 80 carp, 2 rabbits. Pest management principles in real life. So I hope that's clear. So there's a stack of variety of different types of carp control techniques. I've just sort of put up a shopping list there to look at. The electrofishing, the video you saw at the start of the talk. There's lots of different types of nets we use. There's screens and cages. That's my galah, if you heard that. There's tracking of Judas fish. That's fish that we put radio transmitters in, and then we track them back down to the school. And then we can catch the school of fish with nets or other techniques, and then release the Judas fish again and follow him around again. There's pheromone attractants, there's floodplain and flow river manipulations, there's barriers which are often used in the United States and the Great Lakes, electrical, acoustic, light barriers. There's poison, which is less often used these days, wetland manipulations, and biocontrol. These are the gene drive and the daughterless carp and the carp virus, which I'll come back to at the end of the talk. So there's a bewildering array of techniques we can use. Which combination do we implement? I'd like to return to answer that question to some really excellent community initiatives that I've seen over the last few years. And wherever I see people doing carp control, it always comes down to one or two really dedicated people. And if you have those people, then you can make a difference. So in small lagoons, a few hectares, then eradication is entirely possible using conventional control techniques. And if you have a small lagoon that you can dry out or that you can draw down and then catch the carp, then eradication can certainly be an achievable objective. And then refilling the wetland after you've removed the carp in the winter time, when carp are not breeding, when there's no small fish coming in through the water, you can have a really good outcome for wetlands. And here's one that Tony Lane and Kelvin Berry sent me from a wetland on the Ovens River recently, with the drawdown and then the restoration and then stocking of a threatened or a couple of threatened native species, including freshwater catfish. And this sort of success story led through communities has been repeated in the Deniliquin area by John Canallan with the town wetlands in Deniliquin, also in the Kahuna area through North Central CMA and several other locations as well, the Goa Lagoon in New South Wales. So eradication and wetland recovery is certainly achievable. I'd like now to move to open rivers. Open rivers really challenge professionals in this pest, animal and carp management space. So for me, coming from a fishway background, I saw many carp migrating upstream. This is if you can see my mouse, fish migrating upstream to the dam wall, then moving into the fishway and migrating through each of the slots, around the back here and out into the upstream reservoir. And carp do this all the time. So you can see here a carp control device invented by a weir keeper, someone who was keenly observant in the field, made careful observations that carp jump when trapped, but native fish don't. That kookaburra's on the video, it's not at my place. So Alan came up with a really interesting design through an automated carp cage device where native fish and carp swam in through this funnel trap. The carp jumped over to where you can see the blue barrel and were collected in a holding area. And then on a set timer, the front of the cage lifted up like this and pushed all the native fish through an escape hatch down the bottom. They swam under the carp and out into the river without being handled at all, with only a small time delay. And the carp were kept here and used for commercial fertiliser. So that style of invention through careful observation, we've applied the idea in a commercial situation in the Lower Murray at Lock 1 with a commercial fisher. I think we put this in place in about 2007, and since then it's automatically collected about 723 tonnes of carp through to about 2018, about 10 years of operation, at a maximum of about 5.5 tonnes a day. Doing this automatically, bycatch of native fish has been so close to zero it's hardly measurable, and this has been a wonderful example of collaboration between weir keepers and commercial fishers. It's not something that we'd adopt at every site. It really needs a commercial quantity of fish to make it viable. And those fish have been worth about $1 million over time. I do have a little video here to show you. This is a really old version of the cage, but you can see the carp jumping into the funnel there. Oh, success. So we have improved that so that each jump equals a catch these days. That was a really early version. So those are the style of interventions that are possible in the main river. But But also, there's been a lot of work by Dean Gilligan and many others at the Arthur Rylah Institute over time, and at New South Wales DPI and South Australian Fisheries and many other people, to demonstrate that carp are really dependent on floodplains. They prefer to breed on floodplains in the warm, shallow waters, especially in wet years, So you can get enormous numbers of fish breeding in wet years, and you can get big recruitment events, big survival events following floods, which is why you often see few carp during years of consecutive drought and then many carp during years of consecutive flood. So these annual migrations to these floodplain areas are entirely predictable and exploitable. They're happening now. They happened over the last 6 weeks. Fish are migrating from long and short distances to access these floodplain habitats for spawning. And flow management can be a really useful tool for attracting fish to areas where they can be collected at the floodplain entry and exit points, as Anthony Canellan demonstrated in his PhD. So all those were examples of what can be done at a site scale. I guess you may be interested in what's happening at the national scale. And on the left there, you can see the National Carp Control Plan. That National Carp Control Plan was administered by the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, and it sets out a $15 million package of works to determine the feasibility of the cyprinid herpes virus, the carp virus, that started in 2016. And that package of works included quantifying what is the biomass, how many carp are in Australia, will the carp virus be effective, what are the risks of the carp virus, and how could this style of carp virus or biocontrol be implemented? And I've got in bold there, what is the biomass of carp in Australia? And that's something that I was involved with, as Teresa said at the beginning of the show today. I'll just spend a few minutes on that, but I'll return to the other parts of the carp virus at the end of the talk too. So how many carp are in Australia? This question was posed to the Arthur Rylah Institute a few years ago now. Not a small challenge, but it didn't take us too long to realise that we're sitting on a mountain of data already. So over the last 30 years, myself and many, many other researchers have been out electrofishing and catching carp. So we had access to data from all the state agencies who collaborated from about 5,000 sites over the past 20 years where we'd done electrofishing or sampling and caught carp. And on the left-hand side there of the Australia map, you can see all the little green dots is where we had information for carp. And the number of carp we'd collected was about 570,000. It's a staggering number. So if you think of this as a synoptic map, I guess, that you may see on the weather, on the left there, you can see the Murray-Darling Basin. You can see a network of streams in blue, orange and yellow. And what that's showing is the number of fish that we electrofished with our electrofisher per hour over that 20-year time span. So you can see large numbers of fish at the lower end of the Murray and the lower Darling, then up through the mid-Murray there. And then you can see the individual mass of the fish on the right-hand side. This is how many kilos each one of these fish weighed in a general sense on this synoptic map. You can see quite large fish down in the lower Murray in South Australia. And you can see large fish in these upland areas, these high altitude areas too, where rivers tend to be small, streams, but carp tend to be large. So what do we do with this information? We knew how many fish we caught per hour. We knew their approximate size, but how do we build a statistical model that can use this information to tell us how many carp are actually present? So this essentially means we return to each one of, let me get that right, we return to a subsample of each one of these locations on the left that we originally sampled. And you can see those locations on the right there in red and blue. And what we did was we tried to understand the efficiency of our electrofishing. So when we went through and collected carp, what proportion of fish did we actually catch compared to what was there? It's never 100%, but is it 50% or 2% or 90%? So that was the conversion factor that we needed to adjust our estimates of fish per hour into the actual number of fish that were present. So we carried out these conversion experiments. I've probably butchered the explanation there, so my apologies. But what this actually means practically is we run the electrofishers through the site, we tag the fish, and we put them back. Then we run the electrofisher through again and again and again until we're getting very few untagged fish coming back. And that enables us to then estimate how efficient we normally are with our first pass of electrofishing. Okay, so what happened was, not surprisingly, we're the efficiencies are very different among different habitats. So the electrofisher is quite efficient in small to medium-sized rivers that are partly turbid or partly discoloured. But oddly enough, they're quite inefficient in clear streams where the carp can see us coming and they disappear, swim off, or in super dirty streams where the carp don't necessarily move away, but they're incredibly hard to see for humans to see them to pick them up. And there we have, for Victoria, the conversion. So what we've done is converted that number of fish per hour of electrofishing to the actual kilos per hectare. And you can see in this part of the mid to lower Murray near the South Australian border, high densities, 200, 400 kilos per hectare, right through the mid Murray. And then you can see the same sorts of things in the upland areas where carp are large, but rivers are small. So this enabled us to then scale up and estimate how many carp are present in Australia. Here it is here, and I'll just walk everyone through this. On the left-hand side, on the y-axis, is millions of tonnes, 0.2 million tonnes or 200,000 tonnes through to 1.2 million tonnes. And in a dry scenario, as may be expected, carp numbers are low. And then an average scenario, much like this year, carp numbers are higher because they've got access to the breeding habitats and there's more fish. In a wet year scenario, much like 2016, you can start to see the carp numbers really building. These red lines indicate error or our confidence limits. And then in a series of wet years, much like the 1970s, wet years that we don't see too much anymore, you can see that the actual biomass, the continental biomass in Australia is reaching up to that million tonnes sort of area. This is a very unusual circumstance though. I hope that makes sense, and I'd like to return to, is this estimate real? How much faith can we put in these sorts of statistical models and extrapolations? So we estimated the number of carp from a series of wetlands. You can see the names of those on the left-hand side here, from Yanga Lake in New South Wales right down to Kangaroo Creek Reservoir here. And then there's the biomass in tonnes there, from 1 tonne through to 10,000 tonnes there to get everything on the scale. And you can see the estimates here where the model is predicting in black with the error bars, with the line, and the real world estimates are coming out in the red dots. So for Moira Lake, we had multiple samples over multiple years, and you can see there's pretty much a spot on estimation by the model. And for Yanga Lake, for the lower lakes in South Australia, there was a differential, but many of these other sites, it's within QE. And the locations where there was a differential, there was actually agreement from a lot of the local stakeholders that the model was predicting far better than other estimates. So we've got a lot of faith that this style of modelling is starting to really accurately predict carp numbers. So what does all that mean? I mean, how do we unpack that, unwrap that to actually make it meaningful in the real world? What it actually means is that in the total habitat area that carp occupy, they're present in about 92% of the total area, about 16,500 kilometres. We've mentioned before that 80 kilos per hectare is our limit before there's carp impacts. And so carp, we're over this limit in 54% of wetlands, in 70% of rivers, and 97% of large rivers. So what have we learnt from all that? Is that carp have reached densities that result in ongoing and catastrophic impacts, but meaningful restoration is possible, especially where we have division. For me, what I've also learnt through a long time looking at carp is that they do often disguise their greatest weaknesses as their greatest strengths. So that migration, those huge numbers of fish you see moving around, invading wetlands and migrating up rivers, it can be quite staggering in terms of how to manage that. But with careful observation, we've worked out a number of techniques where we can make a difference. And for me, it's always about using life history bottlenecks to plan your control. So you can see a female carp in the middle there, the large fish, and two male fish. Those fish are spawning out in the shallows of a wetland. Carp are absolutely desperate to get to wetlands and floodplains for spawning, and that behaviour can be taken advantage of. So setting clear objectives, developing local plans with committed people, and staying the course are keys to effective carp control. I guess another lesson for me is that using the science is a really good way to maximise your outcomes for any sort of pest animal control. So I've talked about the integrated pest management principles of setting objectives, using density impact thresholds and multiple interventions. But what we've also got the chance to do these days is to use really sophisticated numerical or population models written by really smart people. And you can see a conceptual kind of drawing I've done here on this page, with on the y-axis, the vertical axis here, the kilos per hectare of carp, and on the x-axis here, the time. So what I've tried to demonstrate here is that when we implement multiple interventions, you can get this style of response from carp populations. One intervention might be something more like this, and no intervention is more like that up the top there. These styles of population models can be simulated via the actual code written by population modelers, and we don't have to go into the field and implement these techniques. We can simulate this on the computer, come up with the best combination of techniques to make the fastest difference to carp populations, to knocking them down and getting ecosystem recovery. These are the style of interventions we can make, the planning we can make on the computer before we even go into the field. I guess another important lesson for me is that letting the river do the work is a fantastic kind of motto, where on the left-hand side there you can see a beautiful snag in the Edward River system with fast flowing water. These are the types of conditions that carp don't tend to thrive in, but native fish do. So restoring rivers knocks carp numbers down, but it builds native fish numbers up. And you can see here a Murray cod that I saw recently in the river. He was about 900 mils long, and he'd swallowed it was actually a she, but she'd swallowed a carp there about 600 mils long. So 2/3 of her body length. So where we can get ecosystem recovery and build our rivers, the strength and health of our rivers, then we'll knock carp numbers down. I did promise, I think I promised to return to biocontrol, and I'm just about at the end of the show here. This is the second last slide, so thank you for staying with me. But I did promise to do this. I'm not a virologist, but I will muddle my way through where we are with biocontrol at the minute. So the National Carp Control Plan did evaluate the carp herpes virus. Okay, the latest information is showing that the carp herpes virus through modelling, this is through computer modelling, this virus certainly has not been released into the wild. but through computer modelling, we're demonstrating about a 40 to 60% carp population reduction, and that's demonstrated by computers to be stable for a minimum of 5 to 10 years. Okay, in closed tank trials, no native fish species showed signs of infection. The carp virus works within a certain temperature window range of 18 to about 28 degrees. And at this stage, the whole carp virus program is on hold. The SIP and herpes virus, as a number of research projects finish off, and with COVID delays as well. So I haven't heard of any decision being made. That whole program is on hold, especially while risks are discussed and quantified, and that means risks to water quality from dead carp, the cleanup, the risk to native biota, fish and otherwise, the risk to community values and to commercial fisheries. So that technology is certainly demonstrating itself. The carp virus is present on every inhabited continent around the world except Australia, but it's a massive, huge decision for Australia and governments to make, and that's something that, from my point of view, will be definitely informed by communities, and it's something that personally we should all have a think about. Other biotech on the horizon are gene drive and daughterless carp. These are essentially genetically modified ideas and technology, and these ones we'll be hearing more about. So if I could sum up now and leave you for a couple of moments for questions, just to emphasise that carp have had a catastrophic impact. I would really emphasise again that we need to think about how we want our aquatic system to look like in 5 years' time. Do we want it to look like it does now, or do we want it to look a whole lot better? Something I ask at every project. Developing wetland-specific carp plans with the 80 kilos per hectare threshold is a way forward in every situation. My experience shows me that communities, small groups of people all have a role to play. I've been so impressed by watching community groups re-establish really healthy wetlands and native fish communities in lots of locations around Australia, and I congratulate all of those guys and thank them for their contributions to this talk. We certainly must use the science, perhaps based on multiple interventions, based on really close observations of carp biology and managing river flows. And lastly, I would leave you with, on that positive note, that aquatic systems and their biota can be recovered, and there's lots of demonstrations of that. So I'll leave it there for questions, Teresa and Rich.
Excellent, thanks Ivor. And we've got quite a few questions that have come through. So we'll start from the top. So one of the questions that we got before we'd even started the presentation was from Tony. That was about, do carp affect platypus welfare? Do you know if there's any evidence of that kind of direct connection between carps and platypus populations?
Well, not really to my knowledge. I think the only way carp would really affect platypus is in disturbing bottom silts, disturbing habitat, and reducing visibility for platypus, those sorts of impacts. I'm not aware of any direct impacts on platypus though.
How would you see the Gambusia problem comparing to the carp problem?
Yeah, great question. I see it as being immensely more difficult to deal with. Carp are large fish. There's a lot different and range of techniques available to catch carp in terms of commercial fishing. Gambusia have been spread around everywhere around Australia. These are once called mosquito fish, but these days called plague minnow or Gambusia. They're so difficult to deal with. There's been a good bit of research by Zeb Tonkin and others from the Arthur Rylah Institute a few years ago that set some new directions for Gambusia, but at this stage, very, very tough to deal with.
Can you tell us a bit about how carp manage to infiltrate water bodies such as man-made wetlands? So this person was asking about, they're surprised to see them turn up in a small local wetland in Point Cook in the southwest of Melbourne.
Yeah, great question. Look, it really interests me when I showed the carp map to see some catchments carp free. And I always wonder why that occurs, whether they've got in there and just haven't taken off, or whether they never got in there in the first place. I think from my point of view, people move fish around all the time. Carp have been used as live bait for catching cod, like in the photo there, for years and years, and they move them around for other reasons as well. So a lot of the time it's human intervention, but there's a really recent piece of research coming out, and I've had to buy somebody a bottle of wine over this because I lost a bet, but showing that that a species of duck, from memory, could actually eat early life stages of carp, eggs and larvae from aquatic vegetation, and then could move to a different wetland, and those early life stages would survive going through the digestive process through the gut tract of a bird and would still be viable once they were passed in a different wetland. And that to me was absolutely earth-shattering. So there's also potential for birds to be spreading carp too.
That's incredible. I had heard that there's rumours of gambusia being able to spread by being attached to birds' feathers and flying between wetlands, but yeah, not surviving the actual intestinal tract of a bird. So Deb's also brought a comment up about carp and platypus. So just asking about carp competing for food with platypus and degrading habitat that supports water bugs. So I think definitely that feeding strategy that they have and creating increased turbidity would change the macroinvertebrate kind of populations you'd have that platypus would depend on.
Yeah, it sounds very, very reasonable. You have to excuse me, I'm not really a platypus person. I'm much more of a fish person, but what you're saying, impacting on crustaceans and macroinvertebrates, is certainly feasible.
I think we've got another platypus talk coming up in the future, so we might be able to hit Josh up for some of those questions as well. Were carp amongst the fish kill in Menindee Lakes last year?
Yeah, sure. Yep. Carp were part of the fish kill in the Lower Darling River in the main, the Menindee Lakes too, as the water dried out. Large volumes of carp were killed in the Weir 32 weir pool around Menindee there, but also large numbers of native fish as well. So that was a really unfortunate circumstance, which, a lot of dedicated people are working really hard so that we don't see again. But it comes down to river management, creating permanent flows for native fish, flowing water, fast flowing water in many cases, like where you can see this cod living there, which carp sort of less prefer. So the Darling situation included lots of carp, but lots of native fish too.
How did carp get here in the first place?
Oh, they've been introduced deliberately each time. So by acclimation societies for the early strains way back in the day, along with starlings and sparrows and all those things, I guess. The Ballara strain, the one that we see all the time and we're battling so hard against, was introduced for aquaculture purposes into the Ballara area of Gippsland. It was hit pretty hard by Victorian fisheries, by enforcement, and those fish in the Ballara fish farm were destroyed back in the 1960s. But at that stage, no one knew that they'd been transported up to the Mildura area, to Lake Hawthorne, and they were sitting in that lake, happily contained until the big floods came through in the early 70s, and those fish escaped into the Murray-Darling drainage, and the rest is history.
Cool. We've got a question about, so it's great work at the Ovens River Lagoon, but does flooding just repeat the infestation after that work? Yeah,
good question. It does. I guess this is where you need to select your sites really carefully. I think if you're going to get a reset after a flood, it's no reason not to do the intervention. But if you can choose sites that are less likely to be flooded out when carp might reinvade, like town lakes, and demonstrate proof of concept and that you can get a response, and those locations are not susceptible to flooding, then you can move further and further away. So the Wangaratta situation was an amazing event. It probably will be reset if there's a flood big enough, but there's no reason not to share that success at that location.
Cool. We've got a question around who should deal with the carp and gambusia in Blackburn Lakes. That might be perhaps a broader question around, responsibility or, the driving targets for undertaking control of carp and other invasive species.
Yeah, look, I sacked that slide deliberately from this talk because it's complicated. Who deals with carp in all the state agencies? So normally no one really deals with those sorts of infestations. Sometimes commercial fishers will come in and remove them. Sometimes councils do it. Sometimes it's through land care or water watch or some sort of river care organisation, and sometimes it's through government departments. It tends to be a broad range of people, and normally I guess contacting your local DELP office will be the first port of call. Or you can email me. I can see my email address there. You can shoot me an email.
Excellent. Do you know if that carp virus has any impact on macroinvertebrates or frogs or other kind of off-target species?
Yeah, it's worth having a read. There's a guy called Ken McColl, MCCOLL. I can send out some papers. He's done a lot of research in this carp virus space. I've only briefly mentioned some of the tests that were done, and they were done on a broad range of fish species, Murray cod and silver perch and other fish, but they were also tests done on a broad range of non-fish biota. I think there was chickens and mice, and it possibly was frogs and turtles and all sorts of things like that to demonstrate that the carp virus didn't cause infection in those animals. But around the world, really, the carp virus is present in most inhabited countries, and it has affected carp, and it has infected koi carp, which is the ornamental strain of carp. But to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert in this field, but to my knowledge, it hasn't infected any other fish species or animal species.
Can reducing sedimentation of a river help to reduce carp populations?
Yes, it can. I think sedimentation causes advantages for carp in terms of degraded rivers. So certainly.
Cool. Question about, can you eat carp?
I like to eat carp. I've eaten carp lots of times. My great friend Keith Bell, a commercial fisher from Sale in Victoria, cooked carp for me numerous times. It's good. What I think the secret, you're probably better off getting on YouTube to have a look at this, but the secret for me is to take the belly flaps. It's not necessarily the side fillet that you'd normally take from a fish. The belly flaps tend to have less bones, and a beer batter brings carp up beautifully.
We also had someone come for one of our catch carp days that was sort of talking about how to prepare the fish directly after you catch it, and he recommended putting it straight into an ice slurry to basically stop the spread of those stress chemicals going through the body. And apparently that makes a difference to the taste of the flesh. Yeah,
it's eaten right around the world. Australians are so spoiled for fish protein, but carp's eaten right around the world. It's one of the most commonly cultured fish around the world for human consumption.
What about closer to the mouth of the Yarra and Maribyrnong rivers towards the bay? Is there a big problem with carp? And I guess, in other river systems around the mouth and the estuary systems, do you find that carp are a particular issue there, or is it more in the headwaters?
No, I think carp are most reach the highest abundances in the lower reaches of rivers, where you have less elevation and flooding can cause very rapid and long-term access to floodplains in the flat country. Often where you get high nutrients from adjacent deposition of soils and farming and things like that. So we often see huge abundances of carp in the lower reaches of rivers, including estuaries. Carp often seem to inhabit that sort of freshwater estuarine interface, where they'll move up and down depending on river flow conditions. So if there's a good freshwater outflow after rain, they'll move much further downstream into what would normally be estuaries, and if there's a drought or a series of low flow months, then they'll move further back upstream. So I've seen them absolutely in estuaries many times. I've even seen them out to sea once or twice, flushed out through the Murray mouth, not handling waves in the Southern Ocean too well.
Is there data on which waterways don't have carp? And that might be hard to find, seeing it was about 3% didn't have depending on your data that you showed before.
Yeah, we've got really good data on which waterways don't have carp in Victoria, or right around the distribution of carp. It does get a little bit wobbly towards the high-end streams, which may or may not have been sampled over the last 20 years by researchers. So the smaller the stream, the less information is available in a general sense. But yeah, we have a really good idea about where carp are and are not.
Do their eggs remain dormant during the dry periods?
No, they don't. They're really fragile. I had a picture of eggs spawned onto a cowpat out in a paddock that got inundated, and the carp spawned on the cowpats. I lost it somewhere along the way preparing the talk, but I'd be happy to share it. So once those carp eggs are dried out, they're really susceptible to dying at that stage. That said, they do go through ducts with some proportion surviving, which is something I never thought would happen.
When large numbers of carp die in a waterway, perhaps through some of these control measures, does that create another serious problem by the way of pollution?
Well, it can do. It can do. When a lot of the techniques I've talked about today is removal, commercial removal of carp, so we don't tend to have to deal with dead fish in the river. I guess you would have seen the footage from the fish kill at Menindee, January or February 2019 from memory, but a couple of summers ago, and yeah, they cause issues with water quality, and those fish were removed and buried. But most of the tech that we use is removing carp alive for commercial industries. If the carp virus, one of the major research projects was to look at what would happen if carp died and sort of en masse in waterways, and then what the water quality issues would be, and then the resultant effects on native fish. So those reports are available on the FRDC website, and there were some serious impacts in some locations which would require human intervention to go out and collect dead fish.
We've got a question about how to educate people about invasive species and the threats to native fish species. So this question was talking about their experience is that they're finding Australians care a lot about invasive species, and including kids do, and it seems very hard for developing countries to be more aware about invasive species.
Yeah, look, this is something that comes up again and again. We've got, through government agencies, we've got some really good vertebrate pest animal for established pests. This is not for new pests coming in or threatening, but for established pest animals, we've got really good training programs that lots of Melbourne Water and other professionals have taken part in over the journey. And so that they've been really useful in terms of training new people. A lot of the knowledge is starting to leave the industry now. Over the last 10 years, I've seen some really good people leave the industry and perhaps without passing on that knowledge. So those sorts of programs have been especially important in passing on information about how to manage pests professionally. Did that answer the question, Rich, or did I miss something there?
I think that was pretty good. We'll wait to see if there's any more questions that come from the chat. What precautions can be taken in fish passage designed to minimise carp incursion?
Yeah, good question. I think in terms of native fish recovery, any sort of initiative that enables native fish to recover sort of trumps what would happen with carp. There's a couple of times where fish passage has not been implemented because carp would invade an area that they're not already present in, and that's a special circumstance. But in most cases, carp are already present above and below the barrier, so there's more. I guess there's more success in allowing those native fish to move in between the upstream and downstream to have free passage to try and re-establish populations. there's more positive benefits to that than there is for enabling carp to move around to places that are already present. So it's not ideal, but those are the sorts of decisions that managers need to make. And in some cases, we can put in carp cages, but that's very select, special few places where carp numbers are extraordinary, and we have cooperation from local commercial fishers.
Sue's asking about some of the pockets of no carp around the Victoria and South Australia and the Victoria-New South Wales borders on your map a bit earlier. And do you know why there are pockets like that, or is it maybe a lack of data potentially?
It's not a lack of data. The data's there to demonstrate that carp are not present. There's a really good research paper coming out of the US asking exactly this question: why do some rivers remain uninvaded? And no one knows for certain, but I tend to think there's already a fish or some sort of animal that's occupied that niche. In Queensland, it might be the fork-tailed catfish, which are everywhere, occupying a similar niche to carp. In the coastal rivers of Victoria and the northeast coast of New South Wales, tough question to answer. Not sure, but I think rather than going to rivers and investigating carp impacts and how many carp are there, I think it's just about timely that we went to some of the places where carp are not present and worked out why that was, and that would be really informative in the way we manage carp. So can't specifically answer the question other than say it's a good one.
And our last couple of questions are mostly focused on eating carp. So someone has mentioned that in many Eastern European countries, carp's considered a delicacy. And at Christmas time, they used to be put in town fountains for people to collect and prepare for family celebrations. And Andrew is suggesting that you can put carp fillets into a smoking oven, and that's a good way to eat them. Do you have any other good recipes for carp that you would recommend?
I don't. I haven't got any recipes for carp I'd recommend other than my beer batter, but I do agree in Eastern Europe they are a delicacy, and commercial fishers have been exporting carp and carp roe or carp eggs to those sorts of places on and off over the last 20 years that I've seen. So I think you could probably Google carp recipes and come up with some pretty good recipes. That might be the way to go there.
And we might see if we can link some to when we finally get this video up online as well. So we'll add that if we find some good stuff. And I think that's it for our questions. So I might hand back over to Teresa so she can wrap stuff up for us.
Thanks, Ivor, and thanks, Rich, as well. So what I'll do is I'm just going to share my screen with you, and then you can see what we've got coming up. So as per usual, find... sorry, I'm just trying to move things around so I see you can see my controls. But anyway, so just to remind you that the webinars we've got coming up, we've moved them monthly. And so the next one is going to be Thursday, the 29th of October, and that's protecting freshwater turtles. And then that's going to be followed by Thursday, the 26th of November. We're going to have Josh Griffiths back, and he's going to be talking about, he's doing some eDNA sampling on Werribee River and also Mumboldt Creek. So we'll be able to get the results of that eDNA for platypus sampling. So the recordings will be on the website, and you'll be reminded by email when these become available. If you have any questions or queries, then please contact us at waterwatch@melbournwater.com.au. So I just want to say a big thank you to Ivor. Thanks again to Rich, Elisa, and obviously you all for watching as well. So thanks again for joining, and look forward to seeing you on the 29th of October. Thank you.